welcome everybody, and thanks for inviting me to talk with you. So we're gonna talk about grief and how to help people who may be mourning a loss during this pandemic. So these are the kind of official learning objectives. So we'll talk a bit about like normal grieving and what are the psychological tasks that have to be done when people are mourning a loss, and how resilience comes into play when we're dealing with grief. But also the same principles are applicable with other kinds of stress, including trauma. So some of this will hopefully apply to other kinds of situations you might encounter with clients. And just in the introduction of kind of what I'm interested in or what I do, just with working with the mind and the body and breathing, spiritual practices, we can talk a bit about how you may be able to apply those types of practices and how it relates to resilience, and then how that helps us to deal with emotions when we lose somebody. So I'm hoping that will be helpful as well. And then more specifically to grief, just how do we do that under pandemic conditions, and look at maybe some adaptations of our usual practices that we can use in these well, it's been a year now, but still seems kind of unusual times. So yeah, and we'll have a question and answer too. Hopefully I'll be able to have enough time for that. So so I just wanted to define some terms when we're starting off. Like what do we mean when we talk about grief or mourning? Because there's so many different words. When we talk about bereavement, that means that we've been through a loss, like somebody has died, and so we're the people who are left behind. And then grief technically is the emotional reaction to being in that state of bereavement, and mourning is the psychological process by which the emotions of grief are resolved. But often we use grieving and mourning synonymously, like as though it's the same kind of thing. So if you say grieving or mourning, people generally will understand what you're talking about. But in the literature, those are the technical differences in how the terms are used. And so we can think about bereavement as being a particular kind of stress. And then another kind of stress is trauma, which is some kind of disturbing experience and the reaction to that experience, and they overlap, but they're not the same thing. So here's a diagram that might help to illustrate that. So you have this bigger category of stress, which is like anything that creates some kind of difficulty or tension. You have losses in general, and then when you lose somebody because they died, that's a particular kind of loss. And then there's trauma, and you can have trauma that involves a loss. That loss may be somebody dying, and you can have loss that may be traumatic, but you can also have one without the other. So today, what we're mostly focused on is this, I guess I don't really have a pointer here, but the yellow circle of bereavement. That's what we're focused on today. But given the overlap, some of the principles that we talk about will be applicable to the more general categories of loss and trauma and stress as well. So In a previous version of this talk, I had a lot more slides about what is normal grief and what does that look like. But I think I'll just talk about that a little bit today and then focus more on the tasks of grieving and how to support that. But generally, one model we can think about when you have a loss is you can divide it into 3 stages. Like there's an initial like shock and disbelief kind of phase. And then when you're able to kind of accept what's happened, then there's a phase of having to do some kind of psychological work with that. So there's this preoccupation, negative emotions, introspecting, thinking a lot about the loss. And then when that is done, if you make it successfully through that process, then there's resolution. So you've integrated the loss. It's not like totally happy. There might still be some sadness when you think about it, but you can connect with the positive emotion as well, the positive memories of that person, and you can move on with your life. So you kind of go back to activities you used to do, go back to work, and then start to form new relationships and take on new projects. So, I mean, since loss and bereavement is like a specific form of stress, like it's not surprising that you see a parallel process when you look at dealing with any kind of stressful situation, and trauma is included in that. So there's this initial sort of surprise, disorientation, being thrown off balance, and then struggling with that change, going through some kind of internal process, and then getting some kind of closure and resolution. So I think we can generally think about that as trying to make some kind of order out of chaos. Like something happens that we didn't feel quite ready for, didn't really want it to happen, and it kind of throws us off balance, and then we're trying to regain our equilibrium. And yeah, what we know from surveys of people is that actually most people are fine after they lose somebody, and so most of the people who go through a loss like never like have to see a psychiatrist or a therapist or get any kind of professional help. Um, at least half of them don't even really have any sort of significant distress. They are able to adjust quite seamlessly. And only a small minority of people actually really have problems with grief. So, and that makes sense, I think. Like, I mean, for all of human history, people have been dying. So if human beings were not able to adjust to that and go on with their lives, then we wouldn't really be able to function as a species or society. So, so the normal response is to be resilient and to be able to adapt. And in terms of the time frame in our culture, anyway, it's generally accepted that within about a year, people are in the resolution phase, that they're able to form new relationships. They've gone back to work and resuming their usual activities. So the mourning process isn't exactly the same for every person. So for some people, it takes longer. And some aspects of the experience, like the sadness, may persist even throughout the lifespan. But generally, the emotions are stronger at the beginning, and then over time it gets less intense. So one of the the concepts that I really like and find helpful when talking about the normal resilient response to any kind of stress is this idea of anti-fragility, which is it's the name of a book by Nicholas Taleb. But basically the idea is like inherently with biological systems, like these are systems that are, as long as they're not destroyed, they're improved by stress. And that's kind of like how living things work. And so having a sort of healthy stress allows us to grow and become stronger. And you can see that like in situations like if you've been doing some gardening during the pandemic and starting some plants indoors, if you just grow them inside, there's a certain kind of weakness that they seem to have, at least in my experience. Like if you try to put them outside too suddenly, then it's a big shock and the plant dies. Or um, if there's like a little pest that gets into this like controlled environment that you have inside, then the plants are really not able to resist that. So it seems like having exposure to some kind of, ordinary daily stress, like the stress of being outdoors, adjusting to temperature changes or to the wind, like that helps these organisms to become stronger. And so I think it's the same with people, that with some kind of manageable amounts of stress, including loss, that helps us to grow. So, so most grief people are able to resolve successfully. And then in the situations where they can't, then that becomes complicated grief. And the idea of the talk today is like not to get into like how do you do grief therapy and how do you do counseling for people who have complicated grief, but just to mention it here so you have some idea of what that looks like and why it happens, and when somebody might need a little bit more professional help with their grief. So um, basically the complicated grief, we mean it's overwhelming. It doesn't resolve within the usual expected time frame, or it leads to some kind of maladaptive behavior, like starting to drink too much or doing some kind of risky um, activities. Then it's becomes like a disorder, and um, you can categorize complicated grief as being chronic, delayed, exaggerated, or masked. And those are the usual kind of presentations. If the grief process is not normal, it may be going on for too long, which is chronic, or the delayed reaction is when the person doesn't seem to do the psychological work of grief and they just kind of skip over it and they seem just like they don't feel it, or they're kind of totally fine. But then there might be some other kind of loss later on, and then they have like a kind of catastrophic reaction, like the grief explodes. So that's the delayed reaction, or the exaggerated response is like the emotion is too intense and the person just becomes completely undone. And then the masked grief is where you don't really seem to see the symptoms or the distress. So why the grief gets complicated is because something is blocking the resolution of the psychological tasks. And so in 3 slides from now, we'll talk about what the tasks are. And the reasons for that, like there can be many, but generally they fall into these 4 categories. Like there's an issue with the relationship with the deceased, that like maybe the person was too dependent on them and can't think of like how they'll live without them, or there's some kind of like unresolved conflict in the relationship that the person's not able to process. And then there can be social factors, like if the person doesn't have the necessary social support, then they may not be able to go through the mourning process. So the examples of this is like if the loss is socially taboo, like during um, the AIDS epidemic, like if somebody died from AIDS, like that might have had so much like social stigma that people couldn't talk about it. And then if you can't talk about it, you can't really process it or deal with it. Another example, something that's like socially negated means the society doesn't validate that it is a loss and that you should be mourning from that. So, so people who have a termination of pregnancy or an abortion, that's a kind of loss where there may not be social validation that there is a loss and that the person would be having some grief feelings. And so if they don't have that social recognition, um, uh, they may feel some kind of conflict about the feelings that they have. So, and then the circumstances like bereavement overload, if there's too much loss within too short a time, then there's just too much emotion and the process shuts down. Uncertain loss means that, like for example, like family member of a soldier who's missing in action and there's no body, then it's very difficult to do the mourning process because it's kind of hard to know, like, is the person really gone? Maybe they'll come back. When should we give up hope? So if the loss is kind of ambiguous, then it's hard to begin mourning. And then personality factors is like within the person themselves, like how do they relate to emotions? What's their self-concept? And if they have some kind of personal issue that makes it difficult for them to feel those emotions, then they can also have problems with mourning. So if they for example, like they're sort of compulsively independent, or they've been conditioned growing up to think like, oh, I have to be strong. I can't show any weakness. I can't be dependent on other people. Then they may have some internal conflict and feel like they have to deny some sadness that they might be feeling, and then their grief process gets stuck. So just kind of an aside, like we generally accept that like you can have many of the symptoms of depression when you're going through mourning, but we don't classify that as a clinical disorder. But some of the flags where okay, maybe this is actually a depressive disorder and not just ordinary mourning is if the symptoms last more than 2 months, or they have depressive symptoms that you don't normally see in mourning, which includes like morbid guilt or worthlessness, like they're blaming themselves for things that have nothing to do with um, the loss, or they start thinking like, oh, I'm useless, I'm a worthless person. Like normally when you're going through mourning, you don't have those kinds of thoughts, and so that's a sign that the person may be going through a clinical depression. And if if they're feeling down, like not just when they're thinking about the person who passed away, but they're feeling down like all the time, or about other things that don't have anything to do with bereavement. So And then the other issue clinically with loss is like if the loss was traumatic in some way, then the person may have post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms from that. So it doesn't apply to every loss, of course, because they're not all traumatic, and not everybody who experiences trauma has PTSD, but for some proportion of people, then that may be a clinical issue. But for today, we're more interested in how do we support normal mourning. So yeah, just as an aside, in case you see the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, like these are the well-known stages like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. These are stages that they were described in people who are terminally ill, and so they're coming to terms with their own death. So it's a bit different from mourning somebody who's already died, and it's not you. Um, so yeah, you might see these stages of grief, but it's not necessarily applicable to the situation that we're talking about today. So how we would describe the psychological process that somebody goes through as a survivor, like somebody who's lost a person who's close to them. We can use Warden's 4 tasks of mourning, which are like stage 1, accept the loss and then process the pain of the loss, like to deal with the emotions. Adjust to a world or adjust to life without the person who passed away. And then in the recovery phase, maintaining your connection to the person who died while moving forward and living your life. So I'll talk about each of these 4 stages in a bit more detail, and then how we can support people who are going through that. So the first task is the acceptance task. So in the Kubler-Ross stages, acceptance is the last one. But actually, when you're mourning somebody who's died, it's the first stage. So really, that means you have to accept that the person is really gone so that you can then embark on the other steps of the process. And one of the other ways you can describe that is to actualize the loss, like to really have it sink in, or it feels real to you. And so this is the problem, like when people have this ambiguous loss or uncertain loss, if they can't see the body, they don't have proof that the person has really died, then the reality of the loss doesn't sink in, and then the process doesn't start. So, so this is one important reason why we have all of these rituals that we do when somebody passes away, like to have a funeral, to view the body. In some cultures, you may take the body home and wash the body and prepare the body for the funeral, because it's a way to allow that loss to sink in, that you see with your own eyes that the person is really gone. And also why people need to talk about it. And they may need to talk about the loss again and again and again. And for other people, it may seem like they're just going in circles. And they've already been through it before. Why are they talking about it again? But they need to do that repetition and to tell other people and discuss it with other people and get that validation back from other people in order for the loss to feel real to them, for it to be socially validated. So the rituals then are an important way of actualizing the loss. So I mentioned about the funeral and about bringing the body home, and also why we have some kind of final resting place for people, like some sort of physical location that we associate with that person. So, I mean, traditionally it would be a grave, um, but like maybe, maybe it's an urn of ashes in your home, or if you've scattered the ashes somewhere, then that's the physical location that you would go to. But having some kind of physical representation of the loss also helps with this actualization. And for the people who are not able to attend a funeral or see the body, this may be the next best thing. Like if they can go somewhere and see the tombstone and see the inscription and see, okay, this person is buried here. It helps them to actualize, or to help that loss sink in. And so the problem with the pandemic is that we may not be doing these rituals, at least not in the same way. And it's been going on long enough that I have now heard of situations like this where people haven't been able to go to the funeral, or they haven't been invited to the funeral, and then it's I mean, it creates distress for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is because it then one important way of facilitating the first stage of mourning is not available for people. So so I think, like, I haven't seen anything formally written about this, but just from my understanding of how this works is that some kind of ceremony or even online gathering is helpful and probably necessary, like, so that the loss feels real because everybody is talking about it, and there's this kind of common consensus that, okay, this person has passed away, and we all recognize that. And the other thing that I've heard about is like making a video of the funeral and making it available for people, and I think that's also important. So if people can't attend, then at least they can see that a funeral happened, and the person is really gone. And I think we can still make obituaries, and maybe that may be something that could be expanded on in the virtual age. Like, we used to just take out a thing in the paper, but now it could be that information is online somewhere. I haven't seen too much of this, but there was one one situation where like a teacher at the gym I go to passed away, and they did a sort of online gathering and posted a recording of that on the website so that people could come and look at it. But what I wish they had done more of, and that maybe can be done with an obituary, is like to put some biographical information, like about the person and their life and their family relations and how they died and when they died. And I think it may seem like it's a bit, too much information, or it's kind of personal to put all of that information in public. But I think there's a tradition of doing this because people need to know, like, it needs to feel real to them that the person passed away. And having this information about why, like, how the person died, what happened when they died, that helps to get that sense of closure. And just as an aside, because I don't think I made a slide about this, but like, when you talk to somebody who's been through a loss, like, generally it's okay to ask them about things like that, like, how did the person die, when did they die, How did you find out? And asking those kind of questions. I mean, you may need to know if the person was close to you so that you can do your own work. But even if you don't know the person and you're just trying to support the bereaved individual, asking them may also help them with this first stage, that when they go over it again and they talk about it, uh, the more they repeat that information, the more it sinks in and the more it feels real to them. So from that perspective, it's not impolite to ask questions like that. You're actually probably helping the person. So, and then in terms of graves and markers, if you can't go to the funeral, then it may be very helpful to go to the final resting place and pay respects. So there, put some information here about eulogies, that it's like highlighting the person's accomplishments and telling some information about their life in order to honor them and then induce some positive emotion in the people who hear the eulogy or inspire them. And the eulogy helps with a lot of the different processes of grief. So I think it's very powerful and very important to do eulogies and to listen to them. But so with the first stage, for sure, like to like make the loss real, but also like maintaining a connection to the person, which is the fourth stage, bringing up positive emotion, which helps to process the negative. That's the second stage. So you really get sort of benefit on multiple levels from eulogies. And so I think those are important. And what I would encourage people to consider is that that these should be available for people who are mourning to review somehow. Like they should be recorded and posted online, along with a video of the funeral, like for people who are like would have otherwise attended the funeral but couldn't. So excuse me, there's I think that brings up some questions about, you know, how public or how private the funeral or the funeral video should be. You know, should we be kind of more private and respecting the family's privacy, versus should it be public and other people have a right to mourn? And I don't know if there's any sort of, you know, officially accepted policy about this. This is just my personal opinion based on my understanding. But I think that these things should be public, and then we should try to make them more widely available rather than just having like a small private ceremony and, you know, nobody else is invited, and, you know, you don't make the information widely available. And my reason for thinking this is that, in my opinion anyway, like the funeral is not just for the people who are closest to the deceased. Like when you have a life, you have so many contacts and relationships and connections with other people. And so, you know, to me, like, you know, why is it up to the family to say that they have a right to mourn and nobody else does? Or, you know, only close family friends do and other people don't. Like maybe they had a close relationship with somebody else, like I don't know, like a professional client or a coworker or colleagues, students, maybe somebody they had a relationship with in the past and then they became estranged, but that relationship was still important in that person's life. So So I think doing a funeral and doing these rituals is kind of like a public service, like for people who may need to do some mourning of this loss, and we don't really know who that is necessarily. So I think we shouldn't assume. But I mean, that again that's my opinion for what it's worth. So when somebody passes away, there's also secondary losses, meaning other things in your life change because of losing that person, because of the role that they filled in your life. And then it's necessary to adjust to those changes as well. And so it may be necessary to sit down and get some clarity about, okay, what else have I lost besides the person, so that you can also mourn those things as well. And yeah, there's also like hopes and dreams and future experiences, anticipated things that you might also have to mourn. Like particularly when a child dies, for example, there's like thinking about, like, you know, the future that you anticipated with that person that's not going to happen. Like that also is a kind of loss that has to be worked through. So yeah, so we talked about like mourning the loss of a person, the secondary losses. So the same general principles apply to other kinds of losses as well. That you have to first accept them in order to go through the psychological process of letting them go. So I won't talk too much about that there, but hopefully you may be able to see some of the parallels there. Like if you don't have some kind of proof about the thing that you're trying to mourn, like relationship breakup is a good example. I think if you're off again and on again and off again, then you're not able to let that person go. Like there has to be some kind of clear break a lot of the time in order for you to get over that and move on. So how we understand that, you can kind of applying the same logic with bereavement, can see why you may need to actualize the loss in order to get the closure. So the second stage is processing painful emotions associated with grief. And so I just put in this little story about Patacara in order to illustrate that process. And actually, this is sometimes I tell my patients this story, like not all the time, but if it seems suitable, I may mention it. So Patacara was one of the Buddha's female disciples who, so she's one of the foremost disciples in one particular area. So she's described within the scriptures. And her backstory was that she went through a number of very painful losses within a short period of time, basically losing everything. She came from a wealthy family, and I think it was a servant of the family that she fell in love with, and they ran away and got married and left town. And she had 2 children, and she wanted to go back after the first one to tell her parents, but didn't end up doing that. But then after having the second child, she decided she would travel back to her home community and show her parents their grandchildren. So Yeah, so her husband accompanied her, and they all went, traveling back to her community. And then along the way, there was a storm, and her husband went out to, I think, get some firewood or something, and he was bitten by a snake and didn't come back. And then the next morning, she went out and found his body, and so he died. And then she uh, tried to continue on the journey, and came to a river and was trying to cross the river, and she couldn't take both of her children at the same time, so she left the older one um, at the shore of the river while she was trying to carry the other child across the river. And then she was going to go back for the first child, but while she's crossing the river, like a big bird came and snatched the baby from her arms, and then she's crying out uh, in distress that this has happened. And the child who's on the shore thinks that she's like calling to him and waving to him, so he tries to cross the water and is swept away. So in very short order, she's lost her husband and her two kids, and then she's already grief stricken, and she arrives back at her hometown and asks, where can I find Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, looking for her parents. And then she's told that they've already passed away. So now she has nothing. And, yeah, and so it turns out she ends up becoming a student of the Buddha, and she joins his practice community. And then she described in her autobiography that she was sitting on a hilltop and washing her feet, and she saw the droplets of water running downhill, and she saw that some of these droplets were just completely absorbed into the dust before they reached the bottom. And then she had this insight that her life was just like that, that it was like that with her family members, that it's just natural that some droplets of water travel farther than others. And she was able to make peace with that. So sometimes I tell this story to illustrate like what may be possible in terms of grief, that it doesn't have to destroy us, that we could actually have some kind of insight from that. But then there's a lot to unpack, I think, in terms of like, well, how did she actually get to that point that she was able to like look at her loss and the tragedy and the trauma with enough clarity and enough calmness that she was able to reach this kind of understanding. So that's that's the second task, is how do you deal with all of that pain and process that negative emotion so that you can get that sort of resolution or that that closure. So the loss is painful. There's no doubt about that. But these painful emotions also have some kind of useful purpose, and I find it helpful to keep that in mind, that the function of sadness is to prompt us to withdraw and to introspect and reflect on what we've lost, and remember something that we loved, and to get support from other people. And I think if you really think about it, there is no love without this kind of sadness. You may even experience it in the moment, that when you have a really intense feeling of love and connection with somebody, you already feel the pain of that loss, that it's not going to last forever. So So the sadness is a part of that happiness that kind of tells us this is precious, and we recognize that. And similarly, anger has a function of trying to motivate us to right a wrong. When we have guilt, it makes us try to make amends or correct something where we made a mistake. Even physical pain is necessary to sensitize us to potential harm so that we'll avoid it. So we need to experience these painful emotions in order for them to serve their purpose. So we need to allow the experience in, but also to not get stuck on it. And so there's an analogy that I find helpful of the idea of circulation, like the emotion has to come and then it has to go. So it arises and then it flows out. And if you have some kind of blockage that blocks the circulation, then the process gets stuck and then you have problems. So that can happen with complicated grief. It can also happen in people who have like post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. The negative emotion gets stuck and the circulation is blocked. So there's two aspects in my mind, at least, with that. Like you have to allow the emotion and then you have to let it go. So when people have problems with allowing the emotion, generally they're afraid that they'll be overwhelmed. So they get scared of the emotion and they shut it down or they avoid it. And this is often related to previous experience. So if they were previously overwhelmed because they had a traumatic experience, or they had problems like experiencing or expressing certain emotions in their early relationship, then they may have a sort of limitation or restriction with respect to certain emotions. And then they may need some kind of extra help to be able to handle that emotion. But being with other people also increases our capacity, which is why we get together to do things like grieving. So when you have a lot of people together, there's a sort of collective energy that arises. And the group has more capacity for emotions than one person alone, which is why, or one of the reasons why I think therapy works. So it may be enough just to be there for the person and listen to them and to do it together. But if that's not enough, then they may need a bit of extra help, like kind of dealing with these restrictions or limitations from their past experience. So this is another little aside, but when we have platitudes, which is like a sort of thing you say to kind of redirect the conversation if somebody is talking about something you're uncomfortable with. For example, saying, "Oh, everything will be all right. It all happens for a reason," or you know, your life is not that bad. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. If you say things like that in the spirit of shutting down the discussion, it often is a sign that you have some kind of restriction in you, that this is overwhelming you, or you're feeling too uncomfortable with that you can't tolerate it. And so when we find ourselves making platitudes, it's a sign, I think, that the person is trying to get support from us and we're not in a place where we're able to offer that. So if you have the capacity, then it's probably better just to sit and listen and try to deal with the emotion inside of yourself. But if you can't do that, I think it's okay just to say, I'm not in a place where I can really do this with you or help you with this, and I'm sorry. Because then at least the other person doesn't feel bad about themselves. So the other issue people can have besides being able to accept the loss is they may get stuck on the emotion. Sorry, I should have said accept the emotion or to allow the emotion to come in. Sometimes the emotion comes in, but then they don't let it go. They just hold on to it. Um, and this often is also related to habits from earlier on in that person's life. So if it's like an emotional pattern that they've been conditioned to, um, one metaphor I use a lot is like it's like the person has become used to eating a certain kind of food, and they sort of get their nutrition from that. The emotions are like a kind of food or fuel for the mind, and what kind of emotions people tend to habitually consume depends on their upbringing and their conditioning. So you can see people who say are like kind of conditioned to kind of feed off of anger, and they're always looking for something to be outraged about because it gives them some energy or some motivation to to go on to the next thing, or people who are like perpetually feeling guilty and not good enough and trying to take care of other people. This has become sort of habitual emotion for them that kind of propels their life forward. So if you have a kind of habitual pattern like that, and it sort of interfaces with the grief, then the grief can then become part of that pattern. Like the person who feels guilty, if then they feel guilty about the person who passed away, then they keep coming back to that guilt and feeding the guilt, and there's more and more of it, and they can't let that go, and they get stuck there. So for that kind of issue, I think it's then necessary to try to help that person to have a different kind of picture in their mind about how they could feel or how they could live. So, and that's kind of like, maybe another lecture or something that you would do in therapy. But if you encounter that, at least you may have some idea, okay, maybe the person is stuck because of that, and they may need some help to see other possibilities, or practice different ways of thinking and feeling. So yeah, one kind of practice you may use, and I kind of regret I might not have enough time to go over it in detail, is like if we want to try to deal with a negative emotion and allow that feeling to come up and also to pass, is it's a meditative practice, but you try to use the breath to come into your body and feel the physical sensation of that emotion, and then try to breathe in some positive quality, like patience or peace, and send it to that uncomfortable area, and breathing out the tension or the discomfort. And the idea is to get away from the thinking, which tends to reinforce and perpetuate the emotion, and just go with the physical feeling, and to find a way in the body to like relax into that discomfort so that it doesn't get stuck. And you let go of the resistance, and then the emotion can come up and pass away. And it's very important to be able to have some positive emotion in this process, because the positive emotion allows the nervous system to relax, and that allows the mind to open so that you can function in a different mode, like where you can be creative and flexible, and to be socially engaged. Um, so, so you can't just experience the negative emotion. You have to have the positive emotion so that the mind is in a receptive state to be able to process it. So yeah, that helps you to relax internally, and I think I, that might be like a topic of another conversation, but at least I can mention it a bit here. So there's some examples of positive emotions, and then it's important to be able to take some breaks in the morning process to be able to connect with those emotions, because you need them in order to deal with the negative ones. So like going back to work, getting a feeling of accomplishment, serving other people, doing something fun, laughing, exercising, that's all important. Yeah, when we have this capacity to process the negative emotion and not be stuck with it, then I think you can make the adjustment psychologically. And I think, at least is my opinion, like what is happening under the hood with Patacara is that, like, with her spiritual practice, she's building this internal capacity to be able to tolerate those negative emotions and relax and allow them to come up and let them go. And then when she does that, she's able to complete this third step, which is making some kind of adjustment in her way of thinking to be able to live without the people who have died. So there may be external adjustments like getting a certain kind of help or learning some particular skill that maybe the deceased person helped us with, and now they're not there to help us. So we have to make that external adjustment to be able to do it ourselves. But then there's also like internal or spiritual adjustments that have to be made, like our sense of self, letting go of things that we're attached to, having some kind of personal growth, restoring self-esteem. There's some kind of like internal shift that has to happen. And yeah, so the example with the droplets of water and having that insight, that's an example, I think, of like a spiritual adjustment. So, yeah. The spiritual adjustment, I think, doesn't necessarily require you to have any sort of spiritual or religious beliefs, but when we're talking about spiritual changes, it could be like your beliefs or your worldview, even like how you think about your life, maybe views of certain entitlements or expectations that you have. You kind of have to let some of that go. And I think that helps you to grow. So it could involve religion, but not necessarily. And then the last task or the last stage is keeping some kind of connection to the person who passed away, but then moving forward as well. So you don't get stuck just looking back, but you don't forget the past either. So you keep that connection, but then move into the future. So another way of thinking about this is that you still have a relationship with the person who passed away, but that relationship has now changed. Like in Buddhism, we talk about the person has changed form. Like they had a physical form before, and now that's different. Like maybe you believe they went on to another life, or their body has been recycled and now manifests in some other forms, in other living things, and their maybe their mental attributes, the memory that you had with that person, some of that still lives on in the people who were connected to them. But so they continue in some way, but it's yeah, it looks different from before. So doing the emotional work, like letting the negative emotions circulate and pass away, I think leaves us with some kind of positive residual, like positive memories, inspiration, um, yeah, that feeling of love and connection that we had. So these are all things that we can keep and stay connected with and hold on to. Um, and so staying in touch with that like gives us something that can make life more positive or more meaningful going forward. And one of the ways of doing this is to use different kinds of rituals. And in the research, they found um, that it's a very common practice to use some kind of ritual to stay connected with the person, but actually, um, I think more often than not, it's a private ritual, like something that's unique to that person or that relationship, rather than being a kind of formal ritual, like being in mourning for the uh, prescribed period of time, or wearing black, or going to doing a certain kind of ceremony, or um, like in my culture, like getting together on the anniversary of the person's death. Um, that's there may be these kind of social rituals or traditional rituals, but a lot of what people end up doing is more private things. So like doing um, like a favorite activity, and remembering the person while you do it, passing their possessions on, um, going to a particular place and visiting it, somewhere that they enjoyed, just to kind of stay in touch with the memory. Just some examples. And so ideally, if we're able to uh, go through all of that psychological work and connect with something positive from the relationship, this can actually help us to grow as people, like to have some kind of insight or wisdom or capacity that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And it's not all the time that this happens, so we don't want to make people feel bad that they're not experiencing that, or put pressure on them like, oh, you're supposed to grow from this. But it's something that may happen that might be kind of like the gold in the wound, something positive that comes out of the difficulty. And of course, we never want to tell people that, oh, it's good that this happened to you, because it's not really desirable, and it doesn't feel good. But rather, what we mean is the struggle with what's difficult produces positive results. So it's not like it's a good thing to go through some loss or trauma, or that is like character building in and of itself somehow. But if you're going to have to go through something difficult, um, at least the struggle with that might lead to something good. And so you may recognize that you're stronger than you thought you were. You may appreciate life more because you see that it's transient. Or there might be some spiritual growth, like with Patacara, like seeing some different meaning in life, or recognizing something about the impermanence of life, for example. So what might contribute to the post-traumatic growth is like having more resilience, having positive emotion, like maybe helps you to get more mileage out of the experience, like to do more with the pain that you have. um, and then yeah, some of the processes like getting the social support, working through things together, um, that may also carry people farther as well. Um, so I just have maybe 15 minutes and I want to leave some time for questions. So try to get through the next 15 slides or so about how do you support somebody who's grieving, especially as a non-professional. So you might, in the first stage, just help them with practical things so that you can take some of the load off and they can focus on the emotional work that they need to do. And also just connecting with the person and being there for them, like for the reasons that we talked about, helps to support their emotional processing capacity. And then also being that person who listens when they're talking about the loss over and over and over and over, just recognizing that this is what they need to do, so you can help them with that. And I think it's important to validate the losses as well, especially if other people may not. Like if it was a pregnancy loss or a suicide and there's some stigma or people don't want to talk about it, then it may be especially important for them to have at least some friend who can talk to them about that. And yeah, so we just want to, oh, sorry, just a second, it's my daughter calling me through the vents. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so in terms of what to avoid, like we talked about avoiding platitudes or trying to offer some kind of solutions. We don't want to skip over the emotional process, like that just needs to come out. So, you know, if you're a professional person, we might be able to help people more with like doing the emotional work. We might be able to give them some advice about some of these adaptations or using these rituals, helping them to make some meaning out of what happened. But I think one of the big things that I'm interested in is helping people become more resilient in advance, so that when they do experience a loss, they have the capacity to deal with it. And enhancing resilience doesn't just help with loss, but it helps with other forms of stress like trauma as well. So it's one of those like high yield things that I think can help to deal with a lot of different potential bad things that can happen in life. And we know that resilience can be enhanced or trained. And it's also common, like it's the default response. Like most people have a resilient response, and only a small number of people have psychological problems. So, I mean, when we're thinking about what is resilience, I think it's basically the qualities of like a survivor person or somebody with a high degree of spiritual attainment, like somebody who's calm, dependable, not easily emotionally disturbed. And you can cultivate that in different ways. Like there's cognitive aspects, moral, physical, emotional aspects, and they're all interrelated. And I'm thinking that may be a topic for another discussion, but at least I could introduce some ideas. So one of them in the positive psychology literature is learning how to think optimistically. So this is the cognitive aspect. Um, Resilient people tend to see bad things as being temporary, uh, just limited to that situation rather than pervasive in their life. And um, that if it's a negative experience, it's because of some outside factors that are um, they couldn't necessarily personally control. So they limit how personally responsible they feel about things that they can't control. And it's also possible to learn these kinds of thinking patterns by recognizing when is the thinking becoming unhelpful, when are we like feeling responsible for things that we shouldn't feel responsible for example, and then trying on purpose to think about positive events and how we were personally responsible for them. So like kind of making a connection between ourselves and the positive things in life. And so you might try this. This is something I like to do at dinner with my kids, is just to ask them about what were they grateful for that day, and how were they involved in that. So it just kind of directs the attention. Resilient people tend to believe that they're able to influence the outcomes in their life, so they're able to do something about the situation that bothers them. And so this thought of what can I do now to make the best of the situation, or another way is like, what does my life require of me right now? Focuses the attention on this kind of active coping, as opposed to the victim kind of mentality, like, oh, things happen to me and I don't want this and I don't like this and it shouldn't have happened and it's this person or that person's fault. And so changing our thinking around that also makes us more resilient. And I just mentioned meditation maybe helps to detach from certain thoughts and be able to have more flexibility in our attention. But I'll just kind of skip over that briefly. It's a big topic. Ethics and morals seems to be important too. It's a part of, I think, every kind of spiritual tradition, and it may be helpful because it gives you some kind of core principles that you can come back to. So it helps to maintain some sense of order when things become chaotic. Belonging to groups or some kind of community is very important as well. We can work with internal relaxation in a physical way. Like, for example, if you practice yoga, like moving the body in different ways, kind of breaking out of habitual patterns so that we can find where is the body limited and where does it have tension, and use the breath to let that go. That's another way. I'll work with my patients in that way. There's an association with being connected to nature as well. So maybe being in some kind of harmonious system that's working well kind of puts a certain picture in our mind that affects how our brain and our body functions. Maybe that's my theory anyway. And also what I was talking about with the plants, and particularly with this pandemic, like if we're staying inside all the time, then that may be making us weaker because we're not kind of adapting to changing circumstances outdoors. So just in general, to summarize, I think we basically want to find some kind of tension-free state where we can be flexible and adaptable. And the opposite of that is when you have too much tension, too much rigidity, you want to control things, you resist change, that makes you brittle. And so it's easy to break. And so I think you need some kind of healing stress to be able to kind of break up that tension and learn to relax. And then the rest of the slides are just summary, like things I mentioned about specifically what we could do for COVID-19. If you can't do funerals, we have to find some other way for people to participate in that ritual, and to feel that the loss is real. We may have to be aware of other losses during the pandemic, and we may be mourning things, but not really even knowing that we're mourning. And so making that explicit, recognizing the loss, that can help. So my takeaway ideas would be, like, if you can do anything, I would say try to incorporate some practices that make you more resilient, and then you can help other people with that as well. So one of the things I've done personally is we started a small meditation group for doctors who are also working with the northern communities, and we'll just get together once a week to do some meditation. And that's one thing we do, like to try to cultivate a little bit of resilience. And then that practice of focusing on the body, using the breath, releasing the resistance, very helpful for dealing with like lots of kinds of emotional difficulties. And my advice for people in the pandemic is there needs to be some way to share information and experiences about people who pass away, and allow people broadly to participate in these kinds of mourning rituals.